I think for me, there's one overarching achievement of COP28, and that was the operationalization of the loss and damage fund. I think that the ACS happening before COP28 was actually a brilliant, mastermind of an opportunity for the African continent to sort of get the voices together and get a dry run of sorts, a practice run, if you will, for what was going to need to happen in order for us to have a version of a concerted view in order to sufficiently deal with the climate subject overall. The African continent represents so much for what the world needs right now and for its future. We have so many things that can be viewed as positive elements in terms of providing opportunities in terms of climate change. So my name is Jabesh Amissah. I'm an engineer by training, a mechanical engineer by training. I'm currently a partner at Arthur Energy Advisors. I'm an energy consultant, and I'm an Africa Climate Ambassador 2024. I became interested in climate change as a result of my work, sort of helping power plant transactions to close. I became embroiled in some, not embroiled, but involved with some environmental issues in working on those and became quite passionate about the potential of climate change and related aspects to contribute towards the work that I've been doing. Over the last 15 plus years, I've been working across multiple continents, starting in North America and taking on projects in other places. And more recently, and for about the last decade, working in Ghana and across West Africa primarily, helping to increase electricity access and improve the operations of African electricity infrastructure. Unfortunately, even though my colleagues were able to make it, my colleagues from Arthur Energy Advisors were able to make it, I was unable to, and I have a small bit of regret about that. But in converging on Nairobi, I think it was linked to the COP in terms of a framework of opportunities for the African continent to get together in order to engage in the climate policy process, as it were, and to engage more in a more coordinated sense with what was emerging as the primary framework tool for engaging with climate. And with that as a backdrop, I think the Africa Climate Summit in 2023 was important towards the African continent sort of coming up with a more common voice about how we wanted to engage, how the African continent and its peoples and its representatives really wanted to engage via the African Union, among other key contributors to engage with COP as a framework for really trying to engage with the climate conversation and get some of the positions moving forward. COP had previously been happening for 28 sessions. 27 sessions before last year. And the progress that had been made was not nearly as significant or as fast as to deal with the 1.5 degree issue. And so the Africa Climate Summit in 2023, in my view, was a useful opportunity for the African continent to speak with a common voice and come to some understandings about what was most important to the continent and its people. The Climate Summit enabled us to have some significant dialogue, right, on sort of what the underlying principles were going to be for what the climate was going to mean to the African continent. In particular, I think that the action plans, and their presentation and some kind of tacit acceptance in terms of climate development for Africa were an important realization. I also think that some of the thematic areas in terms of being able to prioritize investment and financing, pledges, and the like for the African continent and its initiatives was an important thing that came out of the Africa Climate Summit. COP stands for Conference of the Parties, and it's a part of primarily a UN-led series of activities that have been intended to kind of create a platform and a framework around which organizations really from the multilateral environmental agreements perspective could engage. And primarily that was built around country frameworks, so where individual countries sent representatives to engage. More recently, it's been expanded somewhat in order to facilitate private sector engagement with the climate action so that have been ongoing. And I think that a lot of it has kind of served as the fundamental sort of hosting ground, if you will, for intergovernmental negotiations around climate-related matters. And last year, that was held in Dubai. I think for me, there's one overarching achievement of COP28, and that was the operationalization of the loss and damage fund. I think that the operationalization of that and the funding being provided and accordingly managed towards actually helping the African ecological system to deal with some of the effects of climate change, which seem to be impacting the African continent most significantly, especially being the continent that has, I mean, I don't like to say this, but in general, among the poorest populations in the world, I think at present it's believed that over 800 million people around the world don't have access to electricity or modern energy, and 600 million of those are on the African continent. So I think that the loss and damage fund, in order to be able to impact what is primary economic activity across the African continent, to me was probably the most significant outcome of COP28. I will be looking forward to how that gets implemented going forward, but I do think that it was a significant step in the right direction. I thought that it did. I thought that COP28 had set the stage in terms of what the funding framework was going to be. I think that the ACS happening before COP28 was actually a brilliant, mastermind of an opportunity for the African continent to sort of get the voices together and get a dry run of sorts, a practice run, if you will, for what was going to need to happen in order for us to have a version of a concerted view in order to sufficiently deal with the climate subject overall, and to be able to have a stronger negotiation. Having attended COP, I thought that there was a lot more of a balanced and nuanced view from the African continent in terms of our participation. And I thought that the negotiations and the nature of the negotiations and the reporting around the negotiations did show that our preparation allowed us to say no a lot more than simply accepting tacit approval and sort of soft targets for activities, that it felt like there was a lot more accountability being brought to the equation. And so I would say that the Africa Climate Summit did contribute significantly to some of those outcomes, and the ability, like I said, to operationalize something that was such a significant and a significant element of the entire climate conversation in terms of the loss and damage fund. Well, it's quite a dense statement, if you ask me. The African continent represents so much for what the world needs right now and for its future. We have so many things that can be viewed as positive elements in terms of providing opportunities in terms of climate change, in terms of the minerals that we hold of significance to clean energy in all its forms, electric vehicles, phones, batteries, infrastructure overall. However, it does not appear as yet that those opportunities are being leveraged appropriately, nor is the value actually translating to an improvement in the quality of life of the average African. And so basically somewhere between the capital and the resources, there's probably a little bit more of a focus that needs to be placed on indigenous processing and ownership and things of that nature in order to actually be able to achieve in full the potential that the African continent has in order to participate in climate change and climate change related opportunities in a way that meaningfully improve the quality of life of people on the African continent. I think it's a wise idea to make an energy transition for the African continent, because eventually, irrespective of the path that we take, I think that there's a logical path where the world ends up back where we are right now. And so I think it is certainly wise. I think where, reasonable minds can disagree is about the how we make this energy transition and how do we make it just and meaningful to the 600 plus million people that still lack access to modern energy sources in a way that does not make, sort of the poorest people on the planet responsible for paying for the most expensive energy access on the planet. And so I think that it's a tricky question. And I think that there are underlying principles that the business as usual scenario no longer really applies here, where there needs to be a fundamental change about how the energy transition is being considered in order for it to be just and equitable, especially for the people of the African continent. So the commitment in itself is a step in a positive direction. For the most part, it represents a significant opportunity. I think that there was an opportunity missed to set a timeline, because really you're not setting smart goals if you're not attaching timelines to it. So it's fairly difficult to see when some of the commitments are going to come to light, especially given that recent commitments, especially over the last decade, to climate action have been routinely missed, especially by the most industrialized nations. And so to some degree, it's not ideal that developing countries, especially across the African continent, continue to suffer the brunt of what climate change has to offer on the negative side of the scale, without really reaping the commercial benefits that we're seeing from climate change. However, I do think that the commitment as a whole is a positive. It would have been nice. It would have been great if timelines were attached to that so that there's a clarity of understanding. But probably more importantly, that there's some level of accountability would have needed to be attached to the timelines in order to make them meaningful, especially in light of recent sort of historical commitments with their timelines and the lack of performance there. I think that the biomass reliance is one that probably deserves a slightly deeper look. I think it's important to have a green energy transition, but I think that in terms of its implementation, accelerating the energy transition in an equitable manner is probably the best thing that can be done to produce the best possible solution. I think that biomass in many African countries disproportionately has a gender component to it, in affecting the health of primarily a female population to a large degree, but also from an industrialization perspective. It also has a processing paradigm and sort of a second and third step processing consideration to it. And so I do think that it's important that Africa has participates in the solution to the global energy transition. And I think it is important that we give some gender consideration to it, and also that it is just in its consideration of how it actually impacts. I think that right now, a lot of the biomass replacement theory is largely based on LPG, liquefied petroleum gas. I'm not sure exactly how that fits with a green or a clean transition as a whole. And so there's quite a bit more work that is required, not to just go from biomass to LPG, but to really be able to transition to as clean of a possible fuel for the use case of the African continent as possible. I mean, there's very little that we can do in terms of creating minerals that doesn't fundamentally change our environment. And considering that so many of these minerals that are required are present in large volume, cobalt, phosphates, things of that nature, are present in such large volumes on the African continent in terms of the reserves. And I seem to recall having read a report that said that in order to achieve our climate goals over the next decade, the production of these minerals is going to have to go 10x. I think that with that as kind of a benchmark in terms of how the industrialization system in order to provide these raw materials is going to have to go, there's such an opportunity for the African continent to prioritize minerals development as an industrialization goal in order to achieve all of the global energy transitions ambitions as a whole. Raw material exploitation at any cost is not a useful way to go. I think history has shown us as an African continent that as much as we possess a significance of the minerals, because the lack of processing capacity indigenously is difficult to accept. And so as we consider the ways in which we participate in the global energy transition, it's important that we learn to say no more than we say yes, and find ways to make sure that the energy transition in terms of an industrialization perspective resides here. The energy transition is not going to be cheap. And considering that the bulk, basically a large population within the African continent has had almost no energy access throughout basically modern history, and therefore we're unlikely to be contributors to this climate issue. I think that it's important that the next phase of the climate solution is able to sufficiently address the fact that the green and energy transitions are not going to be cheap, and expecting the poorest people in the world to pay the highest prices for them is going to be untenable and lead to unfortunate social and socioeconomic effects. So it's important that our consideration has a holistic view of what the solution needs to be in order to ensure that the African continent feels like their contribution was not just in a level of consumerism, if you will, but as an active participant in what that next phase and its industrialization actually meant for the world.